Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more Jewish, notable Jewish Americans in history. Excuse me. Anyway, today we are looking at Joseph Pulitzer. He was born to a wealthy family of Magyar Jewish origin in Mako, Hungary, April 10th, 1847. And the older Pulitzer, a grain merchant, retired in Budapest, and Joseph would grow up and be educated there in private schools and by tutors. At the age of 17, if I can get the right thing to look at here, the gangly 6'2" Pulitzer would decide to become a soldier and tried in turn to enlist in the Austrian army, Napoleon's Foreign Legion for duty in Mexico, and the British Army for service in India. So yeah, 3 attempts. Nothing. It was mainly each time because of his bad eyesight and frail health, which he would suffer from for the rest of his life. But in Hamburg, Germany, he encountered a bounty recruiter for the United States Union Army and was contracted to enlist as a substitute for a draftee, a procedure which was allowed under the U.S. Civil War draft system. At Boston, he would jump ship and, as the legend goes, swam to shore, determined to keep the enlistment bounty for himself rather than leave it to the agent. And Pulitzer would collect the bounty by enlisting for a year in the Lincoln Cavalry, which suited him since there were many Germans in the unit as well. So he was fluent in German and French, but spoke very little English. Later on, he would make his way to St. Louis, and while doing odd jobs such as a muleteer, baggage handler, and waiter, would immerse himself in the city's mercantile library, studying English and the law. So we have an immigrant from Hungary, which is neighboring to Austria, which is below Germany. To kind of give you an idea where in Europe he's from. But yeah. And would end up coming to the U.S. during the Civil War, which was the 1860s. So yeah, his great career opportunity came in a unique manner in the library's chess room, and observing a game of two habitues, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. He astutely critiqued a move, and the players, impressed, engaged Pulitzer in conversation. The players were editors of the leading German language daily Westliche Post, and a job offer would follow. 4 years later, in 1872, The young Pulitzer, who had built a reputation as a tireless, enterprising journalist, was offered a controlling interest in the paper by the nearly bankrupt owners. At age 25, Pulitzer became a publisher, and there followed a series of shrewd business deals from which he emerged in 1878, just 6 years, as the owner of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and a rising figure on the journalistic scene. Later the same year, he and Kate Davis, a socially prominent Washingtonian woman, were married in the Protestant Episcopal Church. The Hungarian immigrant youth, once a vagrant on the slum streets of St. Louis and taunted as Joey the Jew, had been transformed. Now he was an American citizen, and as speaker, writer, and editor, he mastered English extraordinarily well, and elegantly dressed, wearing a handsome reddish-brown beard and pince-nez glasses, he mixed easily with the social elite of St. Louis, enjoying dancing at parties and horseback riding in the park. His lifestyle was abandoned abruptly when he came into ownership of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. So, yeah. James Wyman Barrett, the last city editor of the New York World, records on his biography, Joseph Pulitzer and His World, how Pulitzer, in taking hold of the Post-Dispatch, worked at his desk from early morning until midnight or later, interesting himself in every detail of the paper, appealing to the public to accept that his paper was their champion. Pulitzer splashed investigative articles and editorials assailing government corruption, wealthy tax dodgers, and gamblers. This populist appeal was effective, circulation mounted, and the paper prospered. Pulitzer would have been pleased to know that in the conduct of the Pulitzer Prize system, which he later established, more awards in journalism would go to exposure of corruption than any other subject. But he would pay a price for his unsparingly rigorous work at his newspaper. His health was undermined and his eyes failing. Pulitzer and his wife set out in 1883 for New York to board a ship on a doctor-ordered European vacation. Stubbornly, instead of boarding the steamer in New York, he met with Jay Gould, the financier, and negotiated the purchase of the New York World, which was in financial straits. Putting aside his serious health concerns, Pulitzer immersed himself in its direction and bringing about what Barrett describes as a one-man evolution in the editorial policy, content, and format of the World. He employed some of the same techniques that had built up the circulation of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and crusaded against public and private corruption, filled the news columns with a spate of sensationalized features, made the first extensive use of illustrations, and staged news stunts. In one of the most successful promotions, the World raised public subscriptions for the building of a pedestal at the entrance of New York Harbor so that the Statue of Liberty, which was stranded in France, awaiting shipment, could be emplaced, set upon. The formula worked so well that in the next decade, the circulation of the World, with all its editions, climbed to more than 600,000, and it reigned as the largest circulating newspaper in the country. But unexpectedly, Pulitzer became a victim of the battle for circulation when Charles Anderson Dana, the publisher of The Sun, frustrated by the success of the World, launched various personal attacks on him as the Jew who had denied his race and religion. The unrelenting campaign was designed to alienate New York's Jewish community from the world. The New York world. Pulitzer's health was fractured further during this time, and in 1890, at the age of 43, he withdrew from the editorship of The World and never returned to its newsroom. Virtually blind, having in his severe depression succumbed to an illness that made him excruciatingly sensitive to noise, Pulitzer went abroad frantically seeking cures. He failed to find them. In the next 2 decades of his life, he spent largely in soundproofed vaults, as he referred to them, aboard his yacht, the Liberty, in the Tower of Silence at his vacation retreat in Bar Harbor, Maine, and at his New York mansion. During those years, although he traveled very frequently, he managed, nevertheless, to maintain the closest editorial and business direction of the newspapers and ensure secrecy in his communications. He relied on a code that filled a book containing some 20,000 names and terms. During the years 1896 to 1898, Pulitzer had drawn into a bitter circulation battle with William Randolph Hearst's journal, in which there was no apparent restraints on sensationalism or fabrication of news. Yeah, at this point in time, Hearst and Pulitzer would be the two big names when it would come to newspapers, and are still popular. One of the Manson family, her name, Patty Hearst, was actually related to William Randolph. I think that's right. But I know I think that's who that was. I may be wrong on the exactness of it, but yeah, Patty Hearst. She may or may not have been Manson family, I can't remember, but she was related to William Randolph Hearst. When the Cubans rebelled against Spanish rule, Pulitzer and Hearst sought to outdo each other in whipping up outrage against the Spanish. Both called for war against Spain after the U.S. battleship Maine mysteriously blew up and sank in Havana Harbor on February 15th, 1898. Congress would react with a war resolution. After a 4-month war, Pulitzer withdrew from what had become known as yellow journalism. The world became more restrained, the New York world would become more restrained and served as the influential editorial voice on many issues of the Democratic Party, and in the view of historians, Pulitzer's lapse into yellow journalism was outweighed by his public service achievements. He waged courageous and often successful crusades against corrupt practices in government and business. He was responsible to a large extent for the passage of the antitrust legislation and regulation of the insurance industry. In 1809, the New York World exposed a fraudulent payment of $40 million by the U.S. to the French Panama Canal Company. the federal government lashed back at the world by indicting Pulitzer for criminally libeling President Teddy Roosevelt and the banker J.P. Morgan, among others. Pulitzer, though, would refuse to retreat, and the world persisted in its investigation. The New York World persisted in its investigation. When the courts dismissed the indictments, Pulitzer was applauded for a crucial victory on behalf of freedom of the press. In May 1904, writing in the North American Review in support of the proposal for the founding of a school of journalism, Pulitzer summarized his credo: "Our republic and its press will rise or fall together. An able, disinterested, public-spirited press with trained intelligence to know the right and the courage to do it can preserve that public virtue without which popular government is a sham and a mockery. A cynical, mercenary, demagogic press will produce in time a people as base as itself. The power to mold the future of the republic will be in the hands of the journalists of future generations." Let's see. 1912 to present. In 1912, 1 year after his death, the Columbia School of Journalism was founded, and the first Pulitzer Prizes were awarded in 1917 under the supervision of the advisory board to which he had entrusted his mandate. Relevant extracts from Pulitzer's will may be read in that link there. Pulitzer envisioned an advisory board composed principally of newspaper publishers. Others would include the president of Columbia University and scholars, and persons of distinction who are not journalists or editors. Today, the 19-member board is composed mainly of leading editors and columnists. 4 academics also serve, including the president of Columbia and the dean of the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. The dean and the administrator of the prizes are non-voting members, and the chair rotates annually to the most senior member or members. The board is self-perpetuating in the election of members, and voting members may serve 3 terms of 3 years. In the selection of the members of the board and of the juries, close attention is given to professional excellence and affiliation, as well as diversity in terms of gender, ethnic background, geographical distribution, and the size of news organization. But yeah. But anyway, yeah. The Pulitzer Prize is named for him, which goes out to journalists, sometimes just writers, but usually journalists. This is what it deals with. This is from Britannica. April 10th, 1847, in Mako, Hungary. Joseph Pulitzer was an American newspaper editor and publisher who was born and helped to establish the pattern of today's modern newspapers. In his time, he was one of the most powerful journalists in the United States. Having been reared in Budapest, Hungary, Pulitzer sought a military career and immigrated to the U.S. in 1864 as a recruit for the Union Army in the American Civil War. After the war, he went to St. Louis, Missouri, where in 1868 he became a reporter on a German language daily newspaper, the Westlich Post. In 1871, he bought a share of that paper but soon resold it at a profit. And he had meanwhile become active in politics and was elected to the Missouri State Legislature in 1869. So he also dabbled in politics, apparently. 1871 to 1872, he helped organize the Liberal Republican Party in Missouri, which nominated Horace Greeley for president in 1872. After the party's collapse, Pulitzer would remain a lifelong Democrat. So, yeah. In 1874, he acquired another St. Louis German language paper, the Staatszeitung, and advantageously sold its Associated Press franchise to the St. Louis Globe, later the St. Louis Globe Democrat. 4 years after he gained control of the St. Louis Dispatch, which itself was actually founded in 1864, and the Post, which was founded in 1875, and merged them as the Post Dispatch. Soon the city's dominant evening newspaper. On August 5th, 1882, his chief editorial writer shot to death a political opponent of the Post Dispatch, and public reprobation and his own ill health prompted Pulitzer to shift his newspaper interests to New York City, where he purchased on May the 10th, 1883, a morning paper, the New York World, from financier Jay Gould. He soon turned that paper into the leading journalistic voice of the Democratic Party in the U.S. and founded the New York World's evening counterpart, the Evening World, in 1887. In his newspapers, Pulitzer combined exposés of political corruption and crusading investigative reporting with publicity stunts, blatant self-advertising, and sensationalistic journalism. In an effort to further attract the mass readership, he also introduced such innovations as comics, sports coverage, women's fashion coverage, and illustrations into his newspapers, thus making them vehicles of entertainment as well as of information. Now, think of how boring most newspapers were up to that point. News of the day, no comics, no illustrations, no sports coverage, just the news. Yeah. Anyway, the New York World eventually became involved in a fierce competition with Randolph William Hearst's New York Morning Journal, and the blatant sensationalism that both newspapers resorted to espousing for the Spanish-American War in 1898, and led to the coining of the term yellow journalism to describe such practices. Failing eyesight and worsening nervous disorders would force Pulitzer to leave his management of his newspapers in 1887, and he would give up editorship of them in 1890, but continued to exercise a close watch over their editorial policies. In his will, Pulitzer endowed Columbia University School of Journalism, opened 1912, and established the prestigious Pulitzer Prizes, which have been awarded annually since 1917. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. And would pass away October 29th, 1911, in Charleston, South Carolina. Uh, when he was in Congress, he actually represented in the United States House of Representatives, New York's 9th District, for one term, being preceded by John Hardy and followed up by Samuel Cox. He would be the State House of Representatives for Missouri, representing the 5th St. Louis District, 1870. Well, even shorter period of time there. Started out Republican, then liberal Republican, and ever after that he was Democrat. Was married to Catherine Kate Davis in 1878. They would have 7 children. Publisher, philanthropist, journalist, lawyer, politician, and was worth $30.6 million US at the time of his death. So, fairly well off and everything. During the Civil War, he fought at the Battle of Dinwiddie Courthouse, Battle of Five Forks, the Third Battle of Petersburg, Battle of Sellers Creek, the Battle of Appomattox Station, and the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, which was, of course, where Robert E. Lee would give up to Grant. Let's see. But yeah, born in Mako, Hungary, Pulitzer Joseph, as was Hungarian custom and how the names were actually ordered. Last name first. But yeah, Mako, Hungary, which was just southeast of Budapest. He was the son of Elise Berger Pulitzer and Philip Pulitzer, who was actually born Pulitzer. The Pulitzer were among several Jewish families living in the area, and it established a reputation as merchants and shopkeepers. And Joseph's father was a respected businessman, regarded as the second of the foremost merchants of Mako. Their ancestors had immigrated from Politz. That might be how it's pronounced. But yeah, municipality and village in Trebek district in Vysočina region of the Czech Republic. in Moravia um, to Hungary at the end of the 18th century. So, yeah. 1853, Pulitzer was rich enough to retire, and his family moved his family to Pest, where he had the children educated by private tutors and taught French and German. In 1858, Philip would pass away, and his business went bankrupt, and the family became impoverished. Joseph tried to enlist in various European armies after work before immigrating to the U.S. He tried and was rejected from the Austrian army, tried and rejected from the French Foreign Legion, and he tried and was rejected from the British Army. Finally, recruited in Hamburg, Germany to fight for the Union, the North, in the American Civil War. Let's see. Enlist in the Lincoln Cavalry and was part of Sheridan's troopers in the 1st New York Cavalry Regiment in Company L, joining the regiment in Virginia in November 1864 and fighting in the Appomattox Campaign before being mustered out on June the 5th, 1865. Not even a full year. Although he spoke German, Hungarian, and French, he learned little English. So, yeah. But his regiment was composed mostly of German immigrants. Let's see. He would return to New York and then head on to New Bedford, Massachusetts to work in the welding industry after the Civil War, but found it was too boring for him and returned to New York with little money. He was flat broke, slept in wagons on cobblestone side streets, and would travel by side door Pullman freight boxcar to St. Louis, Missouri. He sold his one possession, a white handkerchief, for 75 cents. You may go, 75 cents? Remember, this is 1800. 75 cents is quite a bit. Quite a bit. So, yeah. When he arrived at the city, he recalled the lights of St. Louis looked like a promised land to me. In the city, his German was as useful as it was in Munich because of the large ethnic German population, due to strong immigration since the revolutions of 1848. And that's when we really get into his publisher and writer history with newspapers. First being the Westlake Post. Um, he would also serve in the Missouri state legislature as a state representative. Um, while he was still in St. Louis. He would leave the Republican Party, and Schurz, I think, was Carl Schurz, if I remember when I saw it right. Yeah, Carl Schurz. And Carl Schurz was now a United States Senator. Pulitzer and other reformist anti-Grant Republicans voted from the state convention at the Capitol and nominated a competing liberal Republican ticket for Missouri, led by the former Senator Benjamin Gratz Brown. Brown was successful in the November election over the mainline Republican ticket, presenting a serious threat to President Grant's re-election chances. State convention. On January 19th, 1872, Brown appointed Pulitzer to the St. Louis Board of Police Commissioners. May 1872, Pulitzer was a delegate to the Cincinnati Convention of the Liberal Republican Party, which nominated New York Tribune editor Horace Greeley for U.S. president with Gratz Brown as his running mate. Pulitzer and Schurz were expected to boost Governor Brown for the presidential nomination, but Schurz preferred the more idealistic Charles Francis Adams Sr. So Brown had become governor of Missouri and they wanted to push him for vice president, but Schurz was like, no, I have a different idea for vice president. A loyal Brown man alerted the governor of this betrayal, and Governor Brown and his cousin Francis Preston Blair sped to Cincinnati to rally their supporters to Greeley. While in Cincinnati, he met fellow reformist newspapermen Samuel Bowles, Murat Halstead, Horace White, and Alexander McClure, and also met Greeley's assistant and campaign manager, Whitelaw Reid, who would become Pulitzer's journalistic adversary. However, Greeley's campaign was ultimately a disaster, and the new party would collapse, leaving Schurz and Pulitzer politically homeless. 1874, Pulitzer promoted a reform movement christened the People's Party, which united the Grange with dissident Republicans. However, Pulitzer was disappointed with the party's tepid stances on the issues and mediocre ticket led by the gentleman farmer William Gentry. He returned to St. Louis and endorsed the Democratic ticket. Pulitzer's own views were in line with Democratic orthodoxy in low tariffs and limited federal powers. His prior opposition to the Democrats was out of disgust for slavery and the Confederate Rebellion. He campaigned for the Democrats' ticket throughout the state and published a damaging rumor leaked by future Senator George Vest that Gentry had sold a slave, which at this point slavery was over. But yeah, you can imagine why Pulitzer was so against Democrats, because he had come to the U.S. and fought for the Union Army against the South, the Confederacy. So, in 1876, by now completely disillusioned with the corruption of the Republicans and their nomination of Rutherford B. Hayes, the corrupt bargain, which put Hayes in office, gave nearly 70 speeches in favor of Democratic candidate Samuel J. Tilden throughout the country. Schurz, who saw Hayes as a reformer with integrity, returned to the Republican fold. In his speeches, Pulitzer denounced Schurz and urged reconciliation between North and South. While on his speaking tour, Pulitzer also wrote dispatches to the New York Sun on behalf of the Samuel Tilden 1876 presidential campaign. After Tilden's narrow defeat under dubious circumstances, Pulitzer became disillusioned with his candidate's indecision and timid response and would oppose Tilden's 1880 run for the Democratic nomination. He would return to St. Louis to practice law and search for future opportunities in news. St. Louis Dispatch, later to become the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Changing a lot of the way newspapers were, what they presented and everything. 1880, he made a second run for public office, this time for United States Representative for Missouri's 2nd District. However, he was defeated by Democratic nomination for the Democratic nomination by Bourbon Thomas Allen. So remember, he had served one term in Missouri's 5th District, but he failed to get elected again when he ran a second time for the 2nd District. Killing of Alonzo Slayback. When Thomas Allen died during his first term, Pulitzer's Post-Dispatch strongly opposed the Republicans' endorsed candidate, James Brodhead, an attorney working for railroad magnate Jay Gould. The election became heated, and the Post-Dispatch managing editor, John Cockerill, called Brodhead's law partner, Alonzo Slayback, a coward. Slayback entered the Post-Dispatch offices on October 13th, 1882, armed with a gun, and threatened Cockerill. Cockerill shot him dead. The story became a national sensation and turned many conservative Democrats vehemently against Pulitzer and the Post-Dispatch. After a grand jury inquest, Cockerill was never put on trial, and Pulitzer replaced him with John Dillon, former owner of the Post. And unlike Pulitzer and Cockerill, a well-respected conservative native of the city. But it had so damaged Pulitzer's reputation in St. Louis, he began to seek opportunities elsewhere, taking him to New York, where he would buy the New York World. Let's see. They would construct a New York World building. And he would recruit investigative journalist Nellie Bly. In 1895, the New York World introduced the immensely popular The Yellow Kid comic, by Richard F. Outcault, one of the first comic strips to be featured in the newly launched Sunday Color supplement shortly after. The New York World exposed an illegal payment of $40 million by the U.S. to the French Panama Canal Company in 1909. And Pulitzer was indicted for libeling Teddy Roosevelt and J.P. Morgan. The courts, though, would dismiss the indictments. Let's see. Writer and editor of the San Francisco Call, John McNaught, went to New York to work under Pulitzer as his personal secretary from 1907 to 1912. When he left the Evening World, which was the evening edition of the New York World, he would become editor of the New York World through 1915. Through the New York World, he supported the campaign of New York Governor Grover Cleveland for president, which Pulitzer's campaign for Cleveland and against James G. Blaine may have been pivotal in securing the presidency of Cleveland, who won New York's decisive votes by just 0.1%. One of the most famous parts of the Cleveland-Blaine election, Blaine's campaign released a comic illustration going after the accusation that Grover Cleveland had had an illegitimate child. And it would go, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" After Cleveland won, he released "Gone to the White House, ha ha ha," as a rebuttal in a little comic cartoon of his own. So yeah, but anyway, Pulitzer also attacked young Republican Assemblyman Teddy Roosevelt as a reform fraud, beginning a long and heated rivalry with the future president. That was 1884, yeah. Teddy Roosevelt, he would be the vice president under, oh God, I can't remember the name of the president he was under. But anyway, that president would be assassinated in office. Teddy would take over, and then he himself would be elected the next election. And Teddy Roosevelt was pretty decent on a number of things. Pretty good president overall, but there's a lot of stuff that was overhyped for him because he was also kind of a pitchman. Pulitzer would be elected in 1884 to the U.S. House of Representatives for New York, representing New York's 9th District. He led a crusade while in office to place the newly gifted Statue of Liberty in New York City, and actually paying for a pedestal for it to stand on. Because, as we've already discussed, it was still in France at the time. It hadn't even been delivered to the U.S. His rivalry with William Randolph Hearst. Yeah. They were also the cause of the Newsboys' Strike of 1899, a youth-led campaign to force change in the way that Pulitzer and Hearst's newspapers compensated their child newspaper hawkers. Yeah. Get your paper here. You would literally have young boys about the age of 10, 11, 12, 13. Get your paper, get your paper. Let's see. Health, resignation, blindness, depression, and acute noise sensitivity. Bar Harbor, Maine, and Jekyll Island, Georgia were his summer and winter retreats from his actual home in New York, his New York mansion. He would then hire Frank I. Cobb as editor of the New York World in 1904. Pulitzer's own son, Ralph, would take over administrative responsibility in 1907. 1908, Cobb and Pulitzer met to outline plans for a consistent editorial policy, but it wavered on occasion. At the age of 31, 1878, he married Catherine Kate Davis, a woman of high standing from Georgetown, District of Columbia, which is right next in the generality of Washington, which is why the other article called her a Washingtonian. They're all in that little region there, the District of Columbia, D.C. So yeah, she was 5 years younger than Pulitzer, from an Episcopal family, and rumored to be a distant relative of Jefferson Davis. He did not reveal his Jewish heritage to Catherine or her family until after their marriage, to her shock. 7 children, but only 5 would live to adulthood. Ralph, Joseph Jr., Constance Helen, Edith, and Herbert. Herbert would actually become Ralph's partner in the post when Ralph took over in 1809. The 2 children that died is Catherine Ethel Pulitzer, who died of pneumonia at age 2, and the eldest daughter who was born, Lucille Irma Pulitzer, who died at the age of 17 from typhoid fever. That sucks. Almost fully grown. Irish immigrant named Mary Boyle largely raised the children while their parents were busy. While traveling to his winter home in Jekyll Island, Georgia, in 1911, he had his yacht stop in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, and listened to his German secretary read aloud about King Louis XI of France. As the secretary neared the end, Pulitzer said in German, "Leise, ganz leise," which apparently means softly, quite softly, and then died. His body would be returned to New York for funerary services and interred in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. But we talked about founding the Columbia University School of Journalism, given the money so it could be founded. The prizes that bear his name, the Pulitzer Prizes. Apparently, the Missouri School of Journalism was founded with Pulitzer's urging. Both schools remain among the most prestigious in the world. I'm assuming when it comes to journalism. Yeah. Pulitzer Prizes in journalism, the awards have been expanded to recognize achievements in literature, poetry, history, music, and drama. So, like I said, still does a lot of journalism, but other books as well, other authors. But he's had a number of awards and honors. So, yeah. Joseph Pulitzer. Get a good look at who he was. But with that said, we'll go ahead and end this episode here. It's already been over an hour. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting these sources in links in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.